Hey everybody. The other day I was doing some reading about liberation theology and I stumbled across a critique that said liberation theology is simply Christian socialism. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, we've talked about liberation theology on this channel before. It's something that is close to my heart. I enjoy exploring it. For those that don't know, liberation theology is a theology that grew out of Central and South America in the late 50s and 60s, 1950s and 60s, it's been around for a while. It's been explored, it's evolved to meet the needs of many different social groups, many different communities. At its base, what liberation theology tells us is that throughout history, throughout the biblical narrative, we see God on the side of the oppressed. We see God continuously on the side of the poor, on the side of the downtrodden, on the side of the vulnerable. We don't see God on the side of the oppressor. God is seen on the side of the oppressed. Now, like every theology, liberation theology is not meant to give us a system to fix a problem in the world. It's meant to show us the heart of God. It's meant to show us God's desire. It's meant to show us God's will. It's meant to show us God's plan. It's meant to enlighten us to God's nature, to God's character. Liberation theology shows us God's heart. It shows us that God's heart is with the vulnerable people in our societies. God's heart is with the people that are taken advantage of in our societies. God's heart is with the oppressed. Now, it's been said on this channel a few times that Jesus was a socialist. We're going to talk about that another day when I am able to put a few more thoughts together on the subject. But a basic understanding of socialism is a political economic system whereby the means of production, the means of making, trading, and transporting wealth is in the hands of the workers, in the hands of the community. It's a communal system of living. Now, I'm sure there's others out there that have a better understanding of socialism than I do. This is just my, the textbook definition that I remember. Liberation theology is not Christian socialism. Remember, it's theology. It's meant to teach us about God. It's not meant to teach us how we should be humans. In liberation theology, we learn that, again, God's heart is with the oppressed, and therefore, because we learn God's heart is with the oppressed, we are now called to make a decision for ourselves. If we know that God's heart is here, then we have to choose, will we be with God's heart? Will we move in the direction of God's plan? Will we move in the direction of God's desire? Will we move in the direction of God's will or not? Right? Will we be with the oppressed because we know God is with the oppressed? Or will we be on the side of the oppressor? That's what liberation theology forces us to do. It forces us to confront where we will be. It forces us to choose which side we will be on. Will we be on the side of the oppressed or will we be on the side of the oppressor? Now, the reason I say it's not Christian socialism is because it doesn't tell us, it doesn't call for us to enact a socialist society, to enact to put in place a socialist community. It tells us where God is, and it implores us to go where God is. It implores us to grow closer to God by moving towards God's heart. And to do that, we don't need socialism. To be on the side of the oppressed, we don't need socialism. We don't need communism. We don't need Marxism. We don't need capitalism. We don't need any ism. To be on the side of the oppressed, to be where God's heart is, it could involve one of those isms, but it doesn't have to. Perhaps in order to achieve these things, it's a matter of enacting new laws, enacting new formulas for taxation. Perhaps it's raising the minimum wage in a nation, in a province, in a state to a living wage. Now, these may appear to be socialism-like in their nature, but they're not socialism. Socialism is a matter of governing a people in a way that the means of production are in the hands of the people. And we don't have to go to that extreme. We just need to work with the oppressed, for the oppressed, in such a way that we make it increasingly difficult for those who are in a position of power, for those who are in a position where they could take advantage of another, of a person, of a population. We make it increasingly difficult for them to be the oppressor. We make it increasingly difficult for them to take advantage of others. Liberation theology does not tell us that we can exist in a utopian society where everybody is equal and everybody treats each other equally and everybody treats each other as precious. Ideally, I would love that. And I actually think that goes well beyond socialism, well beyond communism, well beyond any of the isms, because the isms always seem to fail, but that's for another day. Liberation theology tells us, as Jesus tells us that you're always going to have the poor with you. Liberation theology, by telling us that God's heart is with the oppressed, by recognizing that there is always an oppressed population. It calls us, liberation theology calls us to be mindful of that. To always be aware that there are people in the world who are living in oppression. That there are people in the world who are being oppressed by others. Whether it's another person, whether it's by a corporation, whether it's by an industry, whether it's by a system. There are always people who are living under oppression. And we, as people who have decided to follow God, we are called to be aware of that and to recognize it. And to follow God to where God's heart is, with the oppressed. In this way we grow. In this way we grow closer to God. In this way we become an active, physical, powerful benefit to our community. In this way we are developed and we are rewarded. In this way we become the people that God's made us to be. We become the people that we can be. May the Lord bless you. May the Lord keep you. May the Lord's face shine upon you. May the Lord's countenance be lifted up to you. May you always know the peace of living in the Lord's presence. And I pray, when you see people living in oppression, you will find yourself gravitating towards God's heart, towards them. Amen.